Hello everyone, I'm just trying to come up with a quick video since I'm getting a lot of questions about feedback loops. I want to be clear on what they are. A feedback loop is a diagram that's similar to a flowchart. If you think about the steps of a flowchart and how you connect them with an arrow and stuff like that. But these are specific to physiology in biology, and they use specific terminology. So for example, in a feedback loop, there are certain elements that are always going to be present. There's going to be a stimulus. This is going to be some event that elicits a response. So something that the body notices, let's put it that way. In order to notice it, you need a receptor to pick up the signal. So that receptor can be things like, for example, in your eyes, you have photoreceptors in your retina. You've got receptors for cold and hot and touch and pain in your skin. So those are like thermoreceptors, nociceptors, mechanoreceptors. Your hearing is also a mechanoreceptor system. Chemoreceptors throughout your body pick up chemical levels, things like pH, levels of carbon dioxide through carbonic acid, and so on. So most of our physiological responses center on monitoring some factor that is kept within a range. So for example, your body temperature, although ideally sort of 37 degrees Celsius, can fluctuate a little bit. There's a bit of room, a bit of wiggle room. But if it goes beyond the range a little too much, then that's the stimulus. Or if it drops below the range too much, it's the stimulus. The receptors that have to pick that up are not just the ones in your skin, but some in your hypothalamus underneath your brain as well. Now, I did mention that we want to get a response eventually, but you need something to connect the receptor system with the effector system. So you have to have, it's sort of like having a receptionist in an office. When you go into an office, you're greeted by a receptionist or someone at a front desk that knows how to direct you further, right? So you coming in is like the stimulus. The coordinator is going to send you to the correct spot. So the coordinator in a physiological response, most often or not, it has something to do with the brain or the central nervous system. It's the traffic cop. It's going to now process information from the receptor quickly, send it to an organ or a tissue called the effector. This is the one that's going to carry out the response. Now, the responses will either eliminate the stimulus or strengthen it. If they eliminate it, it's going to be negative. And that's good. I know we think of negative as bad, but in English parlance, but it's actually a good thing because we want to eliminate this original stimulus. In other words, if we've been monitoring body temperature, for example, and body temperature goes up, then we want to bring it back down, right? It's also possible to have positive feedback. These are kind of rare, and generally speaking, they're really bad in physiological systems because they strengthen the stimulus. The only really good one, for humanity's sake, although it's certainly uncomfortable and painful, is labor. So childbirth is a positive feedback. So those early contractions that happen of uterine muscle get stronger and stronger over time. A great example of a terrible positive feedback is addiction. What happens biochemically in the brain for addiction. So without wasting too much of your time, I want to start drawing a loop to sort of show you how this works. So I'm going to pick calcium regulation, just because it's a fairly straightforward loop. If and to be specific, I'm referring to blood calcium or fluid calcium in general. So it can either increase, so if it increases, that can be as simple as you have eaten something with a lot of calcium in it, right? So now that calcium is in your bloodstream and you need to get it into your tissues. That triggers a hormone called calcitonin. If it decreases, it triggers a different hormone called parathyroid hormone. I'm going to call it PTH. So let's go with increase. You've just had, let's say, a tub of yogurt, one of those mini tubs of yogurts. That is going to be, something that you can now, digest. The calcium absorbs into your bloodstream. So we're going to have an increased blood calcium. That's going to be our stimulus. So I'm going to label it stimulus so we can follow along. That blood now flows through your body, and in this case, it's actually regulated. It's the receptor and the coordinator for this are one and the same. It's actually going to be the thyroid gland. So the receptors are going to be the thyroid gland. And so let's put receptors. I'm just going to put REC. And inside it, you're going to have hormone-producing cells. And they're going to release calcitonin. So this is all part of your receptor and coordinator system. Calcitonin acts on a couple of different effectors. It would be sufficient, when you're doing a feedback loop, it's sufficient for you just to list one, quite honestly. But I'm going to list a couple. So the major one is going to be bone cells, right, or bone as a tissue. And in specific terms, there are cells that build up bone tissue and cells that break down bone tissue. We want, obviously, the ones that build up bone tissue to take that calcium and help convert it to calcium phosphate and, ossify your bones. So those are called the osteoblasts. Also in the kidneys, you've got structures called the nephrons. And generally speaking, they try to save calcium, bring it back into the bloodstream. But depending on the levels, if you really have a lot of calcium in your blood, then your kidneys will sort of treat it as a waste. In other words, we've got enough, let's get rid of what we don't need. So nephrons will secrete calcium into urine. So these are both effectors. Or effector organs. And the response, if you're taking calcium out of the blood, right, and if you're taking calcium out of the blood and putting it in urine, so whether you're putting it in bone or whether you're putting it in urine, the result is going to be the same. This is going to be a decrease in blood calcium. And that's going to be your response. Now, in terms of the actual feedback loop, this is what your feedback loop looks like. You can close the loop by putting sort of another arrow. I like doing these as dotted arrows and sort of marking it with a negative to indicate that it's a negative feedback, right? But honestly, that's pretty self-explanatory even without it. So that's how to do a feedback loop.